Hello everyone. In this week we will discuss the character of Noach. First of all, as I mentioned last week, you can find several interesting um, shiurim on the topic of Noach and the first chapters um, of Genesis in general in the audio archive. Those are a bit longer and more extensive. Today, as usual, we shall focus our attention on a midrash. So the midrash talks about Noach. Noach, it'll be the first verse in our parsha is Eile toldot Noach. Noach ish tzadik tamim haya b'dorotav et Elohim ithalech Noach. So these are the toldot, the um, sort of the story of, let's say, or the offspring of Noach. Okay, there are different opinions of what toldot means. It comes from the root of yalad, to have children, but it can also refer to your story, like your life story. So ele toldot Noach. Noach ish tzadik tamim hayabedorotav. Noach was a tzadik tamim, was a pure righteous man. Et Elohim italech Noach. Noach walked God. He walked in the path of God, or walked with God. So the verse, as it's described, as I just read it, is a bit strange, because the word Noach, the name Noach, appears 3 times in one verse. Okay? Shalosh pamim b'pasuk ne'emar Noach, the Midrash says. 3 times Noach's name was said in one verse. Why can't they just say Ele toldot Noach Haya Ele toldot Noach HaTzadik? Right? These are the story of Noach the Tzaddik that walked with God. She'itelech im Elohim. Why do you need to say it 3 times his name? The Midrash answers, Ze echad mishlosha שראו 3 עולמות נקודתיים. This is one of the 3 that saw 3 worlds. Noach, v'Daniel, v'Iyov. So the 3 that saw 3 worlds, each were Noach, Daniel, and Iyov, Job. So Noach, we know who he is the hero of our parsha. Daniel is a prophet that appears, or sort of on the verge of being a prophet. He is somewhat in between, who was a prophet during the first exile. And Iyov, Job, right? The famous Job, who suffered, and complained about, God's justice in the world. So what 3 worlds did each of these see? Noach ra'a olam b'yishuvo, v'ra'au b'churbanon, v'chazar v'ra'au b'yishuvo. Noach saw the world before it was destroyed. He saw the world being destroyed, and after its destruction, and he saw it also rebuild itself. Right? Noach lived many years after the world was destroyed, and after he emerged from the teva, and during that time he saw his children and grandchildren and great grandchildren. He saw the entire world get repopulated. Daniel ra'a binyan bait rishon. Daniel saw the first temple. He saw the first temple being destroyed, and he saw the second temple. Okay, so he lived to see it be built. The time between the 2 temples was 70 years, so this is not such an impossibility, right? Daniel, as far as we know, was taken when he was very young to the court of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Babylonians. So he probably, was a child when the first temple was destroyed, and then eventually, grew up in the court of the Babylonian king, and lasted until the second temple was built. Iyov ra'a binyan beito v'churbanon v'chazar v'ra'a b'yishuvo. So Iyov saw the destruction of his own house, right? All of his children die, and I forget if his wife dies in the end. V'churbanon, and so he saw it being destroyed. V'chazal v'rabi yeshuvah. At the very end of the story, God gives Eov many children again. Okay, so he sort of helps him rebuild his life after the trials that he put him through. Okay, this is a very interesting midrash in the sense that it portrays this this process of seeing a world that's built its destruction and then it's coming back to being built. And the question we have to ask is, what is this trying to tell us? I mean, there are a few things we can notice right away. For example, even though each one of these saw a world and saw it be destroyed and the world be rebuilt, they each saw it on a different scale or in a different circle of their life. Eov saw the destruction and the rebuilding in his personal sphere, right? The people that suffered were his close family, his children, his daughters, his sons and daughters, and he himself. Excuse me. Daniel saw this on a national level. Okay, he saw the destruction of the temple, and with the destruction of the temple, also the going off into exile, and returning from exile when Koresh declared that they could, and Noach sees it on a global scale, on a universal scale, right? He comes along and sees the entire world get destroyed. Actually, his family, like what was destroyed for Eov, wasn't touched for him, right? His children and their wives and his wife, and, probably their children, if there were any, all survived nicely. So this is only about the global scale for him. But other than that interesting parallel, the question is, what is the midrash trying to tell us? So I'm going to hop over to another midrash, which is also pretty famous, but it has an interesting emphasis, which I think is very telling and might help us also learn something about our midrash. There's a famous midrash that talks about how we notice from the verses that there was a very long period between when Noach began to hear from God and when he, in fact, like God, had him go into the teva. Let me just get a Bible for a moment. Okay, so I can't find it right now, but we do know that Noach eventually began to do the, he went into the Teva when he was 600 years old, but we're told that he was told to do this much earlier. I currently can't find it, but I will try and perhaps post this on MyDrash when I find the exact place where we know this from. Anyhow, there was a very long period between when Noach was told that he's about to that God will destroy the world, and when he actually did. The Midrash says how Noach was basically building the ark, and it took him a very long time because he wanted to get the right kind of wood. So he planted trees, and the trees began to grow, and people asked him, why are you planting these trees? And he said, well, I'm planting these trees because God's about to bring a flood, like in just a few dozen years. And everybody laughed at him, ridiculed him, but he did it anyway, until eventually he had these big trees and he built a wooden ark, and everyone is looking and saying, oh, there's crazy old Noach, building an ark. And then eventually, he kept on warning them, saying, I'm not just building an ark for no reason, I'm building it because God is going to destroy the world, and nobody listens to him. What's interesting about that story, this is a very famous midrash, but what's interesting about this midrash, the way that it appears in Tanchuma is, it says like this. 120 years God warned the people of the Mabul, hoping that they'll do tshuva. because they didn't do tshuva, he told Noach, make yourself tevat gofer. Make yourself a teva made of trees, of these trees of gofer. Amad Noach ve'asa tshuva. Noach stood up and did tshuva, v'nata arazim, and planted arazim, planted these trees. And this is where the story continues, with everybody ridiculing him and him doing it anyway. I think it's interesting here is this part where it says that, okay, God warns the people, and then eventually he tells Noach, listen, you're the only one I trust over here, the only one I think is worthy. Make yourself a teva. And then it doesn't say Noach got up and did a teva. It says Noach got up and did tshuva. And he did tshuva. Okay? And he ran to build the ark. And that's very strange. Did tshuva. Noach, we were told at the beginning of the parsha, that Noach, at the end of the last parsha, it says that Noach, God liked Noach, and then it says in this parsha he was a tzaddik tamim. He was a tzaddik. He was even a tamim. Tamim means completely pure, flawless, right? So flawless. So what is he doing tshuva for? The commentators on the Choma suggest that even a tzaddik has to do tshuva. Even a tzaddik has to somehow repent on something. But that's in that case it's true for everyone. And what is the meaning of the emphasis here for Noach? So I like to propose that the answer to this question is also the answer to the question about the previous midrash of what that midrash is trying to teach us. What is the seeing of a world that is built, its destruction, and the rebuilding of it? Right? What does that mean? What does a person learn when they're exposed to that? The midrash seems to not tell us. The midrash seems to just say, here are three people that saw, three worlds, and leave us sort of to wonder on our own what it was that they learned from that experience. Right? Supposedly, the fact that they saw these things was unique. Right? Most of us don't go through such traumatic events. Of course, some of us do. Some of us lose our families and have to rebuild. God forbid. But for the most part, right, we don't see such total devastation of any of our circles, right? I mean, of course, less than 100 years ago, we had the Holocaust, and in fact, my Rosh Hashiva Zechor Levacha, Rav Mital, has a book that was written about him, which was titled based on this midrash, Olam, also like he saw three worlds: the world before the war, during the war, and after the war, after World War II. But that is still not a standard experience of people. Our lives, for the most part, tend to be linear. We sort of go from one stage to another, and hopefully build, and end up with our, having built something in our lives. We have bumps on the road, but we're able to somehow progress. And what does this mean? What is the midrash trying to say about this experience? So I think the answer, even though the midrash doesn't say it explicitly, is hinted in the way the midrash learns it, or what sort of prompts the midrash to say that Noach was one of these three. What prompts it? We mentioned it prompts it the first verse in the parsha, right? Ele toldot Noach, Noach ish tzarich tanim haya b'dorotav, et ha'elohim ithalech Noach. So, if the midrash says three times the name Noach to indicate the fact that he saw three worlds. If that's the case, maybe the midrash is asking us to read that verse not as referring to the starting point, where we start off sort of, at the beginning of the parsha. That's telling us, these are the story. This is the story, the genealogy of Noach. Noach was a tzaddik who worshipped God, who walked in God's path. No, that's not how we should be reading the story. We should be reading the story differently. We have to read it as Noach in the first world was Ele Toldot Noach. He had genealogy. He had kids. They were born in the first world. Then the second place it mentions Noach as the second world, and the last place is mentions Noach as the third world. Okay, and that's the way that I'm going to approach it here. Though of course people might disagree that that's the way to understand the midrash. But I think it stands to reason that by learning or by referencing the three worlds from this verse, it may be indicating also that we should look at the different ways that Noach is described in each piece. The first piece talks about how Noach, Ele Toldot Noach. That's the first part. This is the genealogy of Noach. So Noach lived like all of us did, right? Before there was any kind of trauma, before the world was about to be destroyed, he simply lived. He had a life. He had a genealogy. He had children, and he had probably a business, and he was doing whatever he was doing. Then, in the destruction, Noach, Ish Tzadik Tamim Abedoltav. So in the process of the destruction, when God decided to destroy the world, and throughout the destruction, right? That's when we look at Noach as a Tzadik Tamim, Bedoltav, right? He was a Tzadik Tamim in his generation. Noach was chosen to be the one to survive because he was the tzaddik, because he was such a righteous person, and so he was able to see the world and being destroyed during that period as part of his life, as part of his being a tzaddik. The most interesting part is the last part. Et Elohim hitalech Noach. In other words, afterwards, when the world was rebuilt, Et Elohim hitalech Noach. Noach walked in God's path. So in other words, before we go into the detailed meaning of this, what the Midrash is saying is that as a result of this process, Noach became a man who walked in the path of God. And if we're right, that this is referencing some sort of a change in Noach, moving from just a man, just living his life, right, having children, Ele Toldot Noach, to being a tzaddik, and then moving on to walking in God's path, we have to ask the question, what is the difference between a tzaddik tamim and a person who walks in God's path? Because now we're realizing that may be a contrast, saying, as the destruction was going on, or right before it, Noach was a tzaddik tamim. But afterwards, he became, he walked in God's path. And this may also link us to the idea that Noach does tshuva somewhere in the process. That other Midrash talks about tshuva, right before the flood, and we can continue it also to after the flood. What is the meaning of that thing? So I think that the Midrash is trying to say that, let's start from a different place. What's interesting about the generation of Noach is that really that's the one generation where, as far as I can tell, where nobody was commanded to do anything. Okay, there was no mitzvot. Adam, the first man, was commanded by God to not eat from the tree. And we also have the general command in the first chapter of Genesis, saying that man should sort of, rule over the world, but that's less of a command and more of a blessing, more sort of a description of his role in the world. A real mitzvah, a real command, what you should or should not do, right? We only find after Noach, right? The famous seven mitzvot of Noach that indicate, the do's and don'ts of people who, even if they're not Jewish, are supposed to abide by. And this whole period had no mitzvot. And the question is, what does that mean? And so I think the most logical idea is that, when your great-great-great-great-grandfather is, Adam, and the world was just created just several hundred years ago, that's an experience that's going to be, very much ingrained in your awareness. That there is a God, that you have to worship that God, that you have to recognize that He's there, okay, that He is the manager of the world, is not that He has to command you by or regulate. It's just part of the world, right? It's just part of the laws of the universe. There is no question or doubt about what is right or wrong. This is how it was until things began to get out of hand. We know that the main sins of the people were not religious sins that led to the destruction of the temple, of the world. It was moral sins, but those moral sins are an indication you forgot who's running the world. There's no religious sins yet, because how could there be a religious sin? There was no commands yet. There's no statement of what you must or must not do, right? So it's very difficult, in a sense, to disobey the law when there is no law. But there is a way to disobey morality, which is also a form of law. And when you go ahead and you start stealing from people, which is the major sin that we associate with a mabul, with a flood, then that indicates you've forgotten who truly controls the world, that you're just sort of like, passing it through, and you don't really own anything. The point is that in that time, you could be a tzaddik, but you couldn't walk in God's path. Be a tzaddik. You could be a person who's righteous. You could do the right thing. You could, do good things in the world, but you're not walking in God's path. After the Mabul, after that happened, suddenly there are mitzvot. God gives mitzvot, and then you can walk in God's path. You can follow the direction He tells you, because He told you what to do, and He'll tell you to worship God and not to steal, etc. And you have to abide by those things. But I think the Midrash is saying not only did this change occur, after the flood, but it also was a change that Noach learned from the experience, from seeing a world being destroyed and being rebuilt. And what does that mean? And I think that was the place where Noach realized, by seeing that occur, that everything that he has around him is at God's will, and it's not a natural phenomenon in the sense that it works on its own. And that's also what Eov and what Daniel probably realized when they went through that. If they could start from one place, go into such a deep, go down so far, the destruction of the temple, a person's family wiped out, the destruction of the world, and to reach several years later, whether hundreds of years or a few months, right, or a few years, like 20 years, and see that it's all back to where it was before, at least on a technical level, like on a principle level. Of course, people that are dead, but that in the sense that there is something that I can return to, that leads you to see that actually nothing should be taken for granted. It's all there because God wants it to be there. If He wants it to be there, it will. If He doesn't, it won't. And so when that happens to you, you start walking in God's path. You start following God's rules because you realize that in the end, He's the one who really is running the show, and you walk in His path. You're not just righteous. You're not just doing things because you're a goody two-shoes, because you're just a guy who likes to do what's right. You really realize that He's the one who manages the world, and you follow in His path. And so that process of going deep into despair and rising up and seeing you can rise up from anywhere, right, means that the world is not just some mechanistic, random process, that there's a goal, there's a direction. And that means that there's somebody directing it, and we need to follow Him. So that awareness of a God as a commander, God is running the world, and that we're committed to, was, as expressed by the fact that there are mitzvot at the end of that process. Yeah, there's a command of what you should or shouldn't do. I believe that that's sort of what the Midrash is trying to tell us, that Noach learned from the experience. Shabbat Shalom.